Hey friends, quick announcement before we begin. I've wanted to give all of you who've supported the channel endlessly something extra special. So I'm officially launching the membership section of my channel to include a number of fictional and true scary member-exclusive horror stories. These will be stories written by all of you, but also more in-depth works written by some of my favorite horror authors, and will include not only their previous work, but also channel exclusives that you can only hear in the new and improved Let's Read members section. This will also be available as a new tier for all of you who have supported me on Patreon as well, and have enjoyed early access over there for just $1. All you gotta do is click that beautiful join button located on the top right of the channel's page, and for just $4.99 a month, you'll gain access to one additional full-length episode of terrifying and tantalizing tales. These exclusive episodes will be packed to the gills with creepers, ghouls, and other such ghastly phenomena, written by some of the most talented authors around, including yourself. But those of you that aren't into supernatural or straight-up fictional horror stories, don't worry. I'll still be sticking to my regular, completely free 3 episodes of true scary stories every single week just like usual. There will be no hard paywalls coming, and I promise the channel's regular content won't suffer as a result of this latest spooky venture of mine. So, if filling your time with some of the scariest stories imaginable sounds like your idea of fun, or you just want to hear more of my voice, be sure to join my members section or Patreon and fall deeper into the darkness with exclusive bonus content. Thank you all for your support. Last September, I went on a few dates with a guy I met on Hinge, and at first, we really hit it off. He was charming, intelligent, respectful, and, well, we sort of fell into bed after the second date, then ended up spending a few weekends together. I know I shouldn't have let him on like that, but lockdown had me feeling really, really lonely. Couple that with the fact that I've been working in COVID wards all summer, and I had a serious backlog of stress to relieve. But when I had a bit more clarity, shall we say, I decided it just wouldn't have worked with the guy. He was almost 10 years younger, with just starting off a career, and thanks to the religious differences, introducing my parents would have been murder. So, around the middle of October, I bit the bullet and broke it off with him. To say he took it badly would be an understatement. He basically refused to accept it and kept trying to change my mind with long, rambling texts for almost a whole week afterward. I told him we could be friends, but in the end, I just ghosted him. And by Halloween weekend, it seemed he'd finally taken the hint. Cut to Friday, the 30th, the night before Halloween. I was on my way home from work, driving through Manchester city centre, and as I pull into the garage of my flats, I see someone stood across the road wearing some kind of monster mask. Not entirely unusual, as there were lots of people walking around wearing costumes on Halloween-themed nights out, etc. My flat happened to look over the part of the street where this person was stood, with 2 big glass windows leading to a little balcony. So when I finally get in, I walk over to the window to see if the person is still there. They were, still wearing their werewolf mask, and it almost looked like they were looking up at my flat. Bearing in mind that this person is completely alone and just standing there, still as a statue. Weird, but again, nothing to freak out about. It was that time of the year. Then, as I'm changing into my comfies and making a cup of tea, a pretty horrible idea pops into my head. What if the guy outside was the one I'd just broken it off with? What if he'd taken the whole thing so badly that he decided he wanted to, I don't know, teach me a lesson? The thought actually made my blood run cold for a second, and with a grim curiosity, I walked back over to the window and took a look outside. My heart sank when I saw the person was still there, not moving, and although the mask did make it difficult to see what exactly they were looking at, it looked an awful lot like they were just staring up at my window. I then realized that I was in a bit of a predicament. I could text the guy, ask him if he was in Manchester, but that might mean he just misinterpreted it and I'd be bombarded with texts and calls again. Considering the guy wasn't doing anything wrong, I decided to just leave it. Just because someone was acting weird, it didn't mean it was all about me. So, after telling myself to stop being so narcissistic, I just tried to relax and enjoy my Friday evening. About an hour later, I'd ordered food, so once I got the ding that it had arrived, I went down to the lobby to pick it up. I open up the door, take my dinner, tip the driver, and I'm just about to shut the door again when I see the same masked stranger stood in the exact same spot on the opposite side of the road. I'm trying to keep calm and telling myself to stop being paranoid, but just as I'm about to bite into my food, someone buzzes my flat. I have one of those phone handset things you can talk to people at the front door with, so I pick it up and say hello, only to be greeted with silence on the other end. I think someone might have just buzzed the wrong number or rang it and run away as a prank. That happened way more than you'd think, the perils of living in flat number 01. So, I hang up. But then the buzzer rings again, and when I pick up, I can blatantly hear breathing on the other end. Ticked off, I slam the handset down, march out onto the balcony of my flat, then look over the edge to where I could look down at the front doors. And there he is, Mr. Wolfman Mask, stood right in front of my building's buzzer panel. He was there for me, and like I said, I had a bloody good idea of who it was. I remember what I shouted down at him, 4 angry syllables echoing around the street. "Leave me alone." The Wolfman looked up at me, then sprinted off round a corner. Then I walked back inside, grabbed my phone, and text the guy I'd just broken it off with. "Try anything like that again and I'm calling the police," I wrote, then immediately called my sister back in Yorkshire to tell her every little detail. The conversation probably went a lot like you can imagine. Me complaining about this clingy, bloody psycho, her sympathizing and advising me to call the police next time he tries anything. Me and my sister can stay on the phone for hours at a time just rabbiting away, and that's exactly what we did for a while after. I can't even describe how much her voice made me feel that bit safer. And then, about an hour and a half into our chat, I get an incoming call from the guy I was dating, so I tell my sister I'm gonna rag him before giving her a call back. I answer the phone, then basically launch into him about how if I thought he was going to be such an idiot about it, I'd never have gone out with him in the first place, and that if he tries calling at my flat again, in a bloody mask, like some psychopath, I'd be reporting him to the police. At first he was just gobsmacked. Like, "You what? What are you on about, girl?" And I totally mistook that for him being on the back foot because I'd rumbled his horrible little scheme. But then he goes on to swear that it wasn't him. Again, I call him out, calling him a liar and asking who else would be stalking me wearing a freaking Halloween mask. He used to talk about how much he loved horror films, so I thought that this was a dead giveaway. Then right while he's insisting it wasn't him and that he's not even in the city center, someone starts knocking at my door. I wasn't really thinking straight at the time, so I put the phone on my shoulder, walked towards my front door and called out, "Hello?" I could still hear the guy I was seeing making his case on the other end of the phone, but from the other side of the door, clear as day, I hear a man's voice saying, "Trick or treat." I just froze. If I had the guy I'd been dating on the phone, who was this person at my door, and how did they get into my block of flats? I get that same sinking feeling as I look through the peephole of my front door, only to see that same werewolf mask was staring back at me. You know how people say things like, "I was so scared I could hear my heartbeat in my ears"? I'd never known what that meant until that moment. This feeling of terror just ebbed up in my chest, and then I could hear it. Thump, thump, thump. Then I just reacted, hanging up the call with the guy and calling 999. I couldn't stop my voice from shaking as I spoke to the operator, and when I confirmed a few preliminary details, I shouted so the man in the mask could hear me through the door. "I've got the police on the phone. I suggest you leave before they turn up." Their response was simply to punctuate their next few words with bangs on my front door. Trick or treat. All I could think to do was hide in my laundry cupboard and beg the police dispatcher to send whoever she could as fast as she could. I was absolutely terrified whoever was outside would break in and find me. Then all I'd be able to do would be able to hold the laundry cupboard door shut with my legs. When he finally began to try to break down my door, I burst into tears. The dispatcher promised me that the police were on their way, but all I could think was, it's going to be too late. By the time they get here, it'll be too late, and I might not even be alive to see it. The whole time, the guy I'd been dating was trying to call me back, so every few seconds I'd have to decline the call to stay on the phone with the 999 operator. I know that's a weird detail to bring up, but it was honestly the perfect way to exacerbate an already horrific situation. At this point, I feel like I should address something obvious. Some of you might be asking, if she's in a block of flats, why aren't the neighbors doing anything? Surely they can hear all the commotion. Well, without giving away too much personal info, the Manchester City Centre flats I live in have only 2 large apartments on each floor, and each set of apartments is locked off from the main stairwell with a keypad. Apparently, a big part of luxury apartments is soundproofing and privacy, because only one person could have known what was happening to me, my neighbor in flat 2. And apparently, they either weren't home or were too scared to intervene, thinking it was domestic or something, I don't know. Either way, no one from my building was coming to help me, and I knew it. And then, literally when things can't get any worse, the dispatcher tells me that the police have arrived, but that they can't get into the building without a key. They're buzzing my apartment, but I'm still in the laundry cupboard with the guy trying to smash through my front door. I try to time it so I can jump out of my apartment, run to the intercom thing, and buzz them in, all without the guy breaking in and catching me vulnerable. But if anyone deserves a thank you, aside from the police officers to respond, of course, it's whoever made my flat's front door. Because the guy outside went ballistic on that thing, and it barely even cracked. I can barely describe the relief I felt when I suddenly heard the police announcing themselves. The thudding on my door suddenly stopped, and the next thing I heard, a pained yelp as they tackled him. I'm just guessing all that because when I opened the door, 2 police had the guy pinned to the floor and were in the process of handcuffing him. What followed was weirdly like a scene from Scooby-Doo, where the baddie's mask comes off at the end and they all recognize him as like the disgruntled janitor or whatever. Except, in my case, the police pulled the guy's monster mask off, but I didn't recognize him at all. And given that I didn't know him, I couldn't imagine why he might have targeted me in such a way. It wasn't until early this year that I found out who he was and why he was targeting me. Like I said, I didn't recognize the guy, but I had met him before. The reason I didn't recognize him was because he didn't have a ventilator on. When the police had gone through his phone during the course of their investigation, they'd found numerous pictures of a nurse, pictures he'd obviously taken without her being aware. Those pictures were of me. I treated him back in April of 2020, one of literally hundreds of patients we'd had that month, and the visual difference between a dying patient and a relatively healthy person is night and day in some cases. He could have come up and introduced himself, and I wouldn't know him from Adam. When they arrested the guy and got him back to the station, the police found that he was in possession of a knife, plastic zip ties, and emergency contraceptive pills. Hearing about that last part made my head spin. Like, I actually struggled to comprehend how evil a person has to be to plan that kind of thing out, to consider the consequences, and plan accordingly. The guy is still on remand awaiting trial, so I doubt there will be anything in the news about it until the verdict has come through. The whole thing has been on my mind a lot more since it's coming up on the anniversary. It feels horrible using that word, but I suppose that's exactly what it is. And with that other murder in the UK news right now, it feels like it's happening more and more. Like the pandemic kind of squashed that kind of crime for a while, but now these psychos feel like they've got catching up to do. Maybe that's just me being slightly hysterical, but as my sister said, can you honestly blame me? I just hope the verdict goes my way, and a predator like that is taken off the streets for a long, long time. But the reality is, he'll probably be free to offend again, much sooner than any of us would feel comfortable with. This happened like 12 years ago now, and this is my friend's story, but it's legit one of the most frightening things I've ever heard, so it'll fit well in this thread. Back when my best friend was in college, she ended up going to an off-campus Halloween party with a few of her sorority sisters. It's there she had a chance meeting with a girl who claimed to have gone to summer camp with her back when she was like 13. The girl seemed to remember a bunch of stuff about my friend's life. Stuff she was halfway to totally forgetting, so the way she explains it, it was kind of freaky but nice to catch up with someone from so many years ago. They have some drinks, smoke a little, but nothing heavier than that. Yet still, within like an hour of being at the party, my friend starts feeling out of it. Like this half-nauseous, half-exhausted feeling where all she wanted to do was go back home to bed. Her new friend calls her an Uber, then walks her down to make sure she gets in it properly, all pretty cool of her, at first glance only. She said she woke up sometime later and totally didn't recognize her surroundings. She wasn't in her sorority house, she wasn't back at her parents' place, and she was still in a really bad way. She'd puked up all over herself and she couldn't find her phone or purse or any of her personal belongings. She then rolled off some dirty old couch in her room with just bare mattresses on the floor, then walks to the door and opens it, which is when she hears two people talking to another room. She recognized one voice as the girl she'd met at the Halloween party, but she didn't recognize the other, and it was a guy's voice. She said that as she walked towards where their voices were coming from, she noticed it was still dark out, which kind of freaked her out because she said she'd felt like she'd slept for hours. Then as she's walking towards the voices, she begins to hear what they're talking about, and it wasn't good. The guy was talking about how they couldn't move her now, and you don't know enough about her. And it definitely sounded like he and the girl she'd met were arguing. The girl started talking about how she's perfect, no one will miss her. Then my friend walks in and asks them who they're talking about. And that time, she didn't know that it was only those three in the apartment, but it soon dawned on her that it must have been her that they were referring to. My friend starts asking what they meant, and they totally change the subject and pretend that they weren't even arguing. Then the girl suggests she goes back to the couch to get some more sleep. She doesn't even acknowledge the puke on her or the fact that she might need to go to the hospital if she just blacked out from some alcohol. Naturally, the friend starts getting really, really suspicious about the whole thing. Like even though she felt like death warmed up, it was obvious how bad the vibes were in that dingy little apartment. So she starts looking around for her phone and purse, but again, she can't find them. She then asks the girl where her stuff is, and the girl won't tell her. She had to threaten to call the cops before the girl returned any of her stuff, and she didn't even hang around to call a taxi. She just wanted out of there. She didn't tell us about this for a long time, and when she did, it was from an "I think these people tried to rob me" perspective. But the more I think about it, the more I think it wasn't just an opportunistic robbery of a drunk girl. I think, and hear me out, that my friend almost got trafficked. I asked her to think about one solid memory of the girl she'd met from camp, and she didn't have one. I then asked my friend if it was possible that the girl could have guessed the stuff about her, or not exactly guessed. I think the girl was using cold reading. I think the girl pretended to know her so she could get close enough to spike her drink with some kind of muscle relaxant or something. Getting spiked would explain why she'd felt like she had a stomach flu for like 24 hours after, as well as obviously accounting for a blackout. Then, there's the state of the apartment she woke up in. I don't think that they were a pair of slobs living there. I think that was some kind of holding facility where girls are kept before they're moved on to other places, maybe even other countries. Finally, if she really did hear the pair talking right, move her referred to moving her out of state so she wouldn't be found any easier, but didn't know enough about her. I'm not sure what they meant there. Maybe the idea was to find girls from broken homes or whatever. They hadn't realized that she was a college student or anything. As for the "she won't be missed" comment, I'm not sure how they could have come to that conclusion. Maybe the girl just wanted to be paid for finding and drugging someone, while the guy knew they had to be more careful. I get a lot of this is purely theory of mine, but it's something I've been obsessed with for quite some time. I've gone over it, analyzed the facts, over and over again. Every single time I come to the same theory. Those people were part of a human trafficking ring operating around the Pacific Northwest, possibly over the border in British Columbia too. And to those who might suggest it, I don't believe my friend, my best friend in the world, would ever make something like that up. We won't pursue it, and she won't pursue it because she's scared of what she might find, not because she's lying. So please, until I can get more information together on this thing, and trust me when I say I'm trying, please be careful around bars and parties around the Pacific Northwest, because there are people out there, people you'd never expect, and they want to turn your life into a living nightmare, all for a few $100. Okay, this happened way back when I was a kid, maybe 6 or 7 years old, so if I can't remember everything exactly how it happened, forgive me, I'm just getting across the gist of it. So it's Halloween in the early 1980s, and me and my little brother went over to a neighborhood friend's house after trick-or-treating. The plan was to stay overnight and enjoy our Halloween candy over some child-friendly movies. I think we watched The Dark Crystal on VHS, if memory serves. Everything went well, and we all went to sleep up in our buddy's room, totally carefree. Then, in the middle of the night, we're all woken up by his dad, who seemed to be in some kind of panic. Our buddy lived alone with his dad after his mom passed away a few years earlier. It was a real sad story. So it was literally just him and his dad, and although he didn't admit to anything wrong, we kids could just tell something bad was happening. And believe it or not, the fact that it was late on Halloween night made the whole thing even scarier. Our buddy's dad then bundles us all up into his car, and we take off way faster than any car I'd been in before. I still remember hearing the screech the tires made and thinking, oh man, we must be going really fast. Again, definitely not good on my nerves when I was already half asleep and panicking. It wasn't until the fact that we'd driven for a good few minutes that our buddy's dad spoke up. He said something like, "Kids, I need you to be calm, but I won't lie to you. Some bad men broke into the house just then, and I think they might be following us." We were like 8 and 6 years old, dude, so we just lost our absolute minds hearing that, wailing and screaming, calling out for our parents, all the while our buddy's dad just keeps revving his engine and driving as fast as he could. My buddy kept asking him, "Dad, who's following us? Please, who's following us?" His dad just kept responding with, "I don't know." And I swear I can still remember the fear in his voice to this day. To kids, grown-ups are supposed to be the fearless, jaded masters of the surroundings, so seeing one scared sure does hit different. We're already in a state of absolute frenzied terror in the back seat, when out of nowhere, my buddy's dad must have looked in his rear view or something because he just screams, "Oh God, they're behind us." Again, cue more high-pitched screeching from the back seat. I remember that all I could really do was hug my little brother and tell him I loved him. He was screaming so hard he was forgetting to breathe, and I honestly remember being worried that he'd die of fright or something. But eventually, we all hear the announcement of I think we lost him. We all managed to calm down a little after that. I can't remember how long we drove for after that. I do remember we stopped at a gas station somewhere just outside of town. The dad didn't drive up to the pumps like the other drivers, though. He drove around back where it was all dark and told us, "Wait here until I come back," before promptly locking us in the car. We waited patiently for a little while. Emphasis on little, though, because it didn't take long before we started to worry about the bad people, whoever they were, finding us in the car, all alone, away from our buddy's dad. That motivated us to get out of the car before anyone bad showed up, and this was also back when you could unlock a car door with those little switch thingies they built into the door, and since we were young and not dumb, we were able to get out of the car. So then me, my little brother, and my buddy all walk around to the pumps hoping to find his dad. We look everywhere, even in the little store where you go to pay, but he was nowhere to be seen. Naturally, we assumed the bad men had gotten him, and that we're going to be lost forever in some strange place, which once again prompts a freakout. This freakout then obviously attracts the attention of people standing around, and one of them must have flagged down a cop car or something, because the next thing I know, there's a state trooper pointing at us like, "Oh my God, it's them! Get 'em!" We hear that "get 'em" like an aggressive "get 'em," you know? And since we're already supposed to be on the lookout for people who wanted to get us, well, you see where this is going. We bolted away from the cop, assuming the worst, and ran back towards the empty car. As you can imagine, the cops quickly catch up to us, grab us up, and take us over to the patrol car. They take us home to our parents, which was confusing to say the least, because we had this idea that they were going to take us to jail. When the cop dropped me off back home, I remember my mom comforting me while the cop talked to my dad about something, and a very watered-down version of that was relayed to me the next morning. I was told that my buddy's dad was not feeling very well, and that there was no real bad men chasing us the night before. They said this guy had a sickness in his mind that made him see and hear things that weren't real, but they seem it, almost like the way a movie seems real. Being 8 years old, all this info just blew me away. I had no idea what schizophrenia was back then, and try explaining some clinical diagnosis to someone who barely understands math yet. But still, I'm glad they put that kind of gentle spin on it, because even as an adult, I find the idea pretty horrifying. According to my mom and dad, the neighbor guy was perfectly normal until he lost his wife. But apparently the grief was so intense that it started him on his sharp, downward spiral, one I don't think he ever really recovered from. I know he ended up in a psychiatric care somewhere, and that our buddy went to live out of state with some relatives, but other than that, I don't really know too much about what became of them. Maybe I'll look the guy up on Facebook, my old buddy, see if he lives nearby. I don't think I'll remind him of that Halloween, though, because, God, if I'd rather not be reminded of it, Lord knows he'll want to just forget all about it. So it's Halloween when I'm 14 years old, and I'm planning on going trick-or-treating. Mom's friend calls, says she's going to a Halloween party, wants to know if I'll babysit their 2-year-old for $20. I say no. She offers $30, I say no. She offers $40, and I realize how much candy I can buy for that, so I shut up and accept her offer before she calls someone else. So I go over to the house, and the kid wanted to go play outside. No biggie, but since it was fall in Alaska, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't too cold out before I accidentally turned the kid into a human popsicle. I step outside to check their thermometer. The front is on a swing and locks behind me as soon as I walk out. I had no phone, and since it was Alaska, the closest neighbor was too far away for me to leave the kid alone in the house to get help. And again, just in case I didn't make this clear, Alaska. So I'm not just going to catch a cold if I get stuck outdoors overnight. I'm going to die, literally. In a panic, I ended up ramming into the door as hard as I could until the lock broke and I could get in. The kid was okay, got in the laundry, but otherwise had no idea anything was wrong. She's all goo-goos and gagas while I'm choking back tears of relief. I thought I would get into trouble for breaking their door, but the mother said I could have broken a window and she wouldn't have cared. That my safety came first and she was just glad I was okay. Just to be clear, I didn't break the door itself, just the lock, and it wasn't a standard deadbolt or anything, just a gate latch that was opened by a hidden string on the other side. The door couldn't be unlocked because the string had wrapped around the locking bolt, so it would pull tighter the more it was pulled. I opened the door by slamming against it enough that the bolt bent and I could get my fingers in there to lift it. It took a good hour or two of bashing the door and about an hour to replace the next day. This is probably going to get buried because there's no mention of ghosts or demons or laughing Jack or anything like that, but in terms of actually being scared for my life, I think this definitely tops the list during my teenage years. Back in the late 70s, when I was in junior high, I was headed to a Halloween party. Purely wholesome, I assure you, with another kid and her mom. I remember this really vividly, but that Captain and Tennille song, Love Will Keep Us Together, was on the radio and me and my friend were singing along to it. I couldn't listen to that song for a long, long time after that night. It just brought back the worst memories. I mean, panic attack level anxiety, and this is why. So at some point in the journey, I can't possibly decide why she thought this would be a good idea, but she decided to race a transit train, hoping to get across the tracks before the train stopped traffic. I remember the moment we stopped singing and realized what she was trying to do. She gunned the car and my heart began to just pound in my chest. I was thinking, no way, she's not, she can't. But she did. Me and my friends are in the back seat actually screaming out no as we got closer and closer to the tracks. All the while we can hear Tony Tennille singing, I will be there to share forever. Such a happy song, but now it just reminds me of this intense fear of death. Thankfully, the train didn't exactly hit us. It was more like she hit the train, but it still did a lot of damage. Luckily, because I was in the back seat, I was injured the least, but I was still pretty messed up from it. I had a pointy piece of metal pierce through my jeans and flesh until it hit bone. Had she been a second faster, the train would have hit us side on and killed us all. I think these days she would have been charged with something, maybe CPS would have gotten involved too, but back then it was just labeled an accident and nothing came of it. Could be because she and her daughter were so badly hurt, like they both suffered broken bones, concussions, you name it. Kinda sad really, but because of the whole parents hating each other thing, I wasn't allowed to be friends with the girl anymore, and her family ended up moving away before the end of the school year. I also know her mom wasn't working and later found out she had serious emotional problems which resulted in her drinking heavily. This probably contributed to why we crashed in the first place, but yeah, the whole thing was just an ordeal. One that left me on crutches for months afterwards. So, I basically had to skip Halloween that year. I run a Halloween supply store here in Minnesota, and on Halloween, I had an employee call in sick on the most important day in our sales calendar. You guessed it, October 31st. They're a trusted, hardworking, loyal employee, so I didn't hold it against them in the slightest, but I won't lie. I was a little irritated when I had to cancel my day off and drive down to the store to pick up the slack. But hey, such are the troubles of being the boss, so I just told her to take as much time as she needed and that I'd fill in for her around the store. I planned on making it to the store before 11 a.m., but truth be told, I couldn't arrive until around the afternoon. And even then, I barely made it there at all because the journey resulted in one of the most frightening things I've ever been unfortunate to bear witness to. So like I said, it's Saturday morning and I'm driving down the interstate in the middle lane. I casually glance up into my rear view and I do a double take when I realize some car is literally zooming down the highway and now on my butt. The car then changes lanes and catches up with me pretty quick. Only when it draws level with me, I look over and see some lady banging on the passenger window with this look of terror on her face. I thought it might have been a prank at first, but it was either a Golden Globe quality performance or something terrible was happening to that woman. I sped up to them and the girl noticed me again, and this started her off screaming, only this time I can clearly make out her shouting the words, "Help me," through the glass. I decided that I couldn't just let it go. I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I found out something happened to her, so I positioned myself behind them so I could follow the car as best I could and pulled out my cell phone to dial 911. I know I shouldn't have been using it while driving, but as the cop explained to me afterward, I did exactly the right thing. They pulled people over for texting or chatting, not when there's a legitimate emergency to attend to. And in this case, the legit emergency was the fact that the driver had one hand on the wheel and was using his free hand to beat the life out of this girl in the passenger seat, the same one begging for help. But anyway, this guy must have seen me with my phone to my ear in his rear view because all of a sudden, he guns his engine and tears off down the highway so fast I could barely keep up. But when I did, he moved over in front of me and came to a complete stop. At that point, I didn't know if he had a gun or what, so I just played it safe, went around him and exited the highway. Where I was positioned, I knew the guy wouldn't be able to drive over the overpass without me seeing his car, but even so, after I got back on the road, he totally managed to shake me off his tail. Thankfully, though, by that point, it was way too late for him, and the cops had enough info to find him and pull him over. I only know this because I ended up passing the car and the cop car that pulled it over, and in a split second, I saw the guy being held down by a cop to be cuffed. I come to find out through local news that the guy in question was the girl's ex and was in the process of basically kidnapping her before driving her to God knows where to do God knows what. It was very scary following them, not just because of what I was seeing, but because at some point I was speeding close to 100 miles per hour just to keep up with the guy's vehicle, hence why I said I almost never made it to my store at all. It was definitely worth it though, because like I said, that guy might have been about to do something really bad to that girl, and I'm just glad I got to have a hand in stopping it. I'm a 911 dispatcher, and I recently was asked a pretty interesting question regarding our busiest days of the year. Well, let me tell you, there's no exact rhyme or reason to emergency calls. They're as random and varied as the people calling in. But I will tell you this, weekends are noticeably busier, and two particular days of the year are ones we come to dread. The 4th of July, because beer and fireworks don't mix, and Halloween. I don't know what it is about Halloween that makes people go crazy. Could be the alcohol or the sugar overload from all the candy, but there's a definite spike every year, especially when Halloween falls on a weekend. So, I think it was either 2014 or 15, but Halloween fell on a Saturday, and if I'd have known what would be in store for me, I'd probably have just taken a sick day. The first was the guy who called sounding incredibly drunk, slurring his words, talking really slow, couldn't remember basic stuff about where he lived, that kind of thing. Only through the course of the call I discovered that, no, this guy isn't drunk. He just seems that way because he'd shot himself in the head and survived. Even now, I don't know whether it was, him attempting to take his own life or just an accident, but the moment of realization, imagining what he must have looked like, I had trouble sleeping after that shift, just to put it that way. Oh, and sadly, he was dead by the time EMTs got there. I thought he might have gone quiet because he was looking out for the ambulance, but no, must have just passed away while I was talking to him. Later that night came the call from a girl who'd apparently been followed home after attending a college party. As she'd gotten home, someone had basically pushed through her door behind her as she unlocked it. When he left, it was safe to do so, and she called 911 and got me. I still remember the way she screamed when she heard knocking on her door again. I had to yell at her to try to make her understand it was the police and not the guy coming back. It was horrifying to think that just a few hours before, this girl could have been the happiest, most carefree college girl in the country. Then all it took was one evil waste of life, and she was completely traumatized. But by far the worst call I got that day, the one that happened almost right at the start of my shift, from the 15-year-old kid who'd arrived home to find that his father had hung himself. I had to basically talk him through the process of finding out if he was cold, and if he wasn't, I'd have to instruct him to try to cut his own hanging father down, all while this poor kid is literally just losing his mind from the horror of it. A few minutes later, the kid stops answering my questions, and the dispatcher next to me gets the emergency call from the neighbors saying they don't know what's going on, but there's a kid standing in the street just screaming. I think about that poor kid a lot, and I absolutely detest his father for doing that to him when he knew his son would be the one who'd find him. As I said, there's very little in the way of patterns that emerge when working dispatch, but trust me, there are 1 or 2 days that never fail to amaze you with how messed up people can be, and Halloween is definitely one of them. It was around Halloween of 2017 that our 4-year-old son introduced us to Blue Mommy. He had learned to talk about 6 months prior, but it was mostly just nonsense talk for a while. That is, until he introduced us to Blue Mommy. At first, we figured it was just an imaginary friend or something, or like a way to make me jealous by claiming he had 2 mommies. We weren't entirely sure. But it was only when we began to ask more about Blue Mommy that me and my husband started to get a little creeped out. According to him, Blue Mommy was almost exactly like me in every way, except for a few key differences. Blue Mommy has all blue skin with long dark hair and all white eyes. We knew that because we asked him to draw her for us one time. Blue Mommy also picked him out of his crib at night and then turned off all the lights without ever having to touch any of the switches. And the thing that really got our attention was when he told us that Blue Mommy's arms and head are covered in bandages because she has a lot of boo-boos. And for those of you that are unaware, boo-boo is what we called any kind of graze or cut. He added that Blue Mommy never, ever smiles, but we later determined this was because she had no mouth. He also told us that Blue Mommy could take her head off and it would still talk like there was nothing wrong. It also happened to be the case that Blue Mommy really didn't like Daddy, and the way our son said it with this big, wide smile was honestly one of the creepiest things I'd ever heard. He told us all of this stuff for maybe a year or a little more, and then it suddenly just stopped. If we ever asked where she was, our son would always point to the same spot, a corner of the room behind his open closet door. He would also wake up crying almost every night during this time, and once, during a really rough night, my husband went in to ask him what was wrong, and his answer was, "Blue Mommy won't let me sleep." Obviously, this was greatly concerning for us, and me and my husband took him to a variety of child psychologists and therapists who thankfully assured us that his behavior was perfectly normal for a boy his age. Some kids have an overactive imagination, only they can't distinguish between what's real and things they've just made up. So as much as there really was no such thing as Blue Mommy, and I won't have a bunch of cranks telling me it was a ghost or whatever, it didn't mean our son wasn't actually suffering in some way. Thankfully, he grew out of the habit, like I might have mentioned, and we moved on to the next child-rearing hurdle that faced us. We laughed about it these days and say stuff like, you know how kids say the funniest things? Well, kids can say the creepiest stuff, too. I'll be going back maybe 10 years here, but one October, I happened to be moving out of the apartment I lived alone in. I had spent the previous few days moving my stuff out, and by Halloween, I only had a few of the heaviest items left over in a closet. Having cleared out the closet almost fully, I noticed serious damage to the interior wall hidden behind an ironing board that I never used. I brought my own. A huge chunk of it was missing, and there was some drywall on the closet floor. I got nervous because I knew I might lose my deposit, so I decided to try and address the issue before my landlady came over to inspect the apartment. After moving everything out of the way, I noticed that the space in the wall fell down into what I assumed was the same closet, but in the apartment underneath me. I knew right away that it was mice or rats because I've seen them do this exact same thing before. Those hungry little idiots eat through anything and everything. Next, I got a flashlight to look down to see if there was a bunch of mice down there and if I needed to call an exterminator or something. Annoying, sure, but better than losing my deposit entirely. So I stuck my head in the hole and shone the light, only to find it was completely free of any signs of vermin. No droppings, no mice, no gnawing marks, but there was one thing I noticed that was definitely out of place, and that was the small ladder in there leading up to my closet. So I freaked out quietly and turned off the flashlight, my head spinning from wondering what I had just uncovered. I saw some light being cast into the space from the lower floor, and I saw a shadow move, as though someone was standing there and then moved when I turned the light off. I yanked the ladder out, actually damaging the wall even more in the process. I then ran out of my apartment and across the street to a Denny's parking lot, where I swiftly called the cops on my cell phone while I watched my apartment for any signs of intruders. As soon as I hung up, I saw the blinds in my window kind of open for a few seconds and then close again. I knew it. There was someone in my apartment, and they must have gotten in through that hole in the apartment below me. But it raised the question, who was living below me, and why were they trying to tunnel into my apartment? The cops arrived within a half hour. I let them into the apartment, and who's hanging around in there but my neighbor from directly below me? Over the next few weeks, I come to discover that he hadn't left his apartment in almost 3 whole years as a result of developing an acute case of paranoid schizophrenia. Apparently, this night wasn't even the first time he'd visited my apartment when I was out. I remember noticing white-gray flecks or powder around the apartment from time to time. I thought it was the stucco ceiling flaking off because the place was so old and there was never any obvious trail back to the closet. But I know now for certain that he got drywall on himself when going through the hole. I also strongly suspect he swept up after himself or at least covered his tracks in some other way. Otherwise, I'd surely have noticed the intrusions much sooner. Another time, I closed the blinds before going out on a hot day to keep the place from getting stuffy and came back to them being open. That must have really clued me into what was going on, but I have this way of doubting myself, like, did I shut the blinds? But the worst part is I remember hearing crying and wailing sounds coming from my closet as far back as a year before I moved out. Long wails that would start and stop in the middle of the night. Piecing those pieces together and realizing why I could hear them so clearly, nothing to do with thin floorboard at all, that really gave me the creeps for a long time afterward. I think their paranoia clearly rubbed off on me a little because when I moved into my next apartment, I pretty much scoured the place for any subtle entry points or any other structural weaknesses. I still love Halloween time. Spirits and demons and monsters are all scary enough, but they'll never be as scary as real people can be. I have a very vivid memory from my childhood that involves eating Halloween candy after going trick-or-treating for the first time. Me and my big sister sat down in her room, emptied all of our candy onto her carpet, then started this elaborate system of trading out stuff we didn't like for stuff we did. For example, I swapped out all my peanut M&Ms for the little chocolate ones because I was at age where my front teeth were wobbly, and then I just let them melt in my mouth. Then right as we're stuffing our faces, Mom walks in and says she needs to take a look at the candy we had, just to make sure it was safe. She then comes back with a bunch of stuff in a bowl and was like, "Have at it, girls." Then the next thing I remember is waking up in the hospital. A pretty nurse with curly blonde hair and bright red lipstick kept worrying over me. I think I may have been strapped down, but I don't remember. I have no idea why I didn't put up a fight because I do remember there being a tube down my throat. To this day, I can't stand the thought of gagging or throwing up. It takes me right back to that hospital bed and this gripping feeling of terror and helplessness. For some reason, I couldn't understand why she was so worried. On top of that, my dad would randomly burst into the room looking pale and terrified, and I didn't understand why he kept leaving until way later when I was told they had my sister and I in opposite rooms. Apparently, my heart stopped 3 times before they were finally able to stabilize me, and my sister was in an even worse state. After that, we never saw our mom again, and it took us years before anyone told us what had happened. Mom had been mad at Dad. They were separated because he'd had a beer before driving us over to her place. So in a bizarre attempt to teach him a lesson, she figured she'd crush up a bunch of rat poison pellets before sprinkling them over our candy. It turned out to be a total psychotic break, and she was institutionalized following the incident. Needless to say, Halloween has never been a holiday I've ever been able to enjoy, and I'm sure you can all understand why. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about all the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.